Since we began this series, more than 50 of America's most accomplished and famous journalists, many of them winners of the Pulitzer Prize and Emmy Awards, have come to Stony Brook to share their stories, stories of their lives, their careers, their work. And one of the very first to come, back in October of 2009, was a soft-spoken, deceptively intense investigative reporter from the Boston Globe. And he told us the story of how he and his colleagues had uncovered one of the most important and shocking stories of the year. Actually, it was a story that he had reported several years before that was still unfolding. If I recall, the audience that night was much smaller. But that's before Michael Rezendes went Hollywood. Now everything's different. So it's my pleasure to welcome him back to the university 7.5 years later, when millions of people now know the story, or a version of the story, of what his team did through the movie Spotlight. How many of you have seen Spotlight? So I gather that's why you're here, right? You know, the message of the movie for me is very simple and crystal clear. The movie actually wins the Oscar exactly 40 years after another journalism movie was nominated for the Best Picture, and that was All the President's Men. And in those 40 years, a lot has changed in America. A lot has changed in journalism, not always for the better. But what that movie makes clear is that it's never been more important, never been more necessary for us to have journalists who do courageous, hard-hitting, penetrating, watchdog stories about important people who don't want us to know what's going on. It also makes clear to me about why it's so important that we have a journalism school here at Stony Brook, so we can train the next generation of reporters who will be fair and fearless in carrying out this mission. It is crucial for the life of this country. Michael's appearance tonight comes a day after the centennial anniversary of the Pulitzer Prizes. 100th anniversary yesterday, they were all awarded. And I was saying to Michael earlier, I can't think of a story that won the Pulitzer Prize that has had as much impact over time as the stories about this abuse by the Catholic Church. That story was broken by Michael and his team in 2002. It is 14 years later, and that story is still affecting people's lives. That's an amazing accomplishment. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome back Michael. I'm going to introduce someone who has known Michael personally very well for 30 years to give you a more up-close sense of Michael Rezendes. Then Michael's going to talk, answer questions, have a conversation, and then answer questions, any questions you want about the movie or his work. Okay? So I'm going to ask a member of our faculty, Rick Hornick, who was a longtime correspondent and editor for Time, Inc., and who has known Michael Rezendes since 1983, to introduce him. Rick?
Yeah, Michael just blanched when Howie mentioned that. I said, well, he was 12 when I met him. Anyway, good evening. In 1983, I became Boston bureau chief for Time magazine. And at the time, I thought I was as tough as any journalist on the planet. I had just come out of 2 years in Poland, covering the Solidarity Uprising, the martial law crackdown, tear gas, water cannon, beatings, secret police, informers. Then I met Mike Rezendes, and I realized that I wasn't the toughest journalist in the world. He was the toughest journalist in the world. A tightly wound guy in his early 20s, working as a political reporter for the Boston Phoenix, an alternative weekly. Mike began his career at the East Boston Community News, and then served brief stints at the San Jose Mercury News and the Washington Post before joining the Globe in 1989. And when I say that Mike was a very tough reporter when I met him in 1983, I mean that Spotlight, this wonderful film, only begins to capture how tough it was to do that story in Boston. Boston, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but anyone who's ever worked there knows that it is one of the most insular, parochial cities in America. Michael and his colleagues succeeded because they had spent years working in that environment, breaking other, perhaps less riveting stories by knocking on a lot of doors, digging up reams of documents, refusing to take no for an answer, scrupulously getting all of their facts right. This is a crucial part of any journalism when you're going after big targets. And standing up to those big targets, to the powers that be, religious, commercial, political, and criminal. And just to give you a taste of what Boston's like, or was like back then, one of Boston's leading crime bosses was the brother of the president of the state Senate. This was not a place for amateurs. Anyway, to me, the genius of the movie is that while it never bogs down in the process, it makes it clear that the Spotlight team succeeded because they were persistent, rigorous, and fair to both victims and the accused. They succeeded because they knew that if any mistake crept in, the story would be discredited and all of their work would have been for naught. So, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to introduce Mike in a minute. He'll speak for about a half an hour. He and I will talk for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. Please join me in welcoming Mike Rezendes.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it, especially on a beautiful evening when people could be out knocking on doors or handing out leaflets for their favorite presidential candidate. Activities that I personally would endorse. And also thanks Rick and Howie. As Rick said, we go back a long, long way to the mean old days in Boston, and it was a pretty tough environment in which to work. As you know, I want to talk about the Spotlight movie. I'm sure you'll all like to know how it got made, and I'm happy that so many of you have seen it. As you know, it won the Oscar for the Best Original Screenplay and also for the Best Picture, which are truly remarkable accomplishments. But what I think's even more remarkable is that the movie really gets it right. It's a very, very accurate depiction of how reporters work a really big story. And I'm hoping there are a lot of journalism students who will watch it and take heart from it and also take some instruction. In any case, I like to say that to all the people who think journalism is a dying business, watch this movie and take that. I do also want to speak to the journalism students directly here and just say a little bit about myself. I went to a big university. I went to Boston University. I was an English major, but I also took some journalism classes. That's one of the nice things about going to a big university. And one of the teachers of one of the journalism classes, she had this notion that in order to really learn journalism, you have to do it. And so she posted a list of editors of local papers on the bulletin board with their phone numbers. And our assignment was to make contact with one of these newspapers and volunteer to write an actual story and get it published. And so I looked on the list and I made my decision based on where I could go by subway because I didn't have a car in those days. So I chose this fighting neighborhood newspaper that Rick mentioned called the East Boston Community News. And I went to a staff meeting. I showed up, and it was a storefront operation, and what I discovered inside was a bunch of political activists who were putting out a rabble-rousing newspaper, fighting airport expansion, arson, a serious drug problem, people who were really committed to trying to make change in their neighborhood. And I liked the outfit quite a bit. I wrote a story, and it was well received. I wrote a second story. They played it on page 1, which I found to be utterly mind-blowing at the time. And I just kept going back, and I wrote for the paper as literally a volunteer reporter throughout my junior and senior year. And when I graduated, the mighty East Boston Community News offered me the job of editor for about $150 a week, which I thought was a small fortune. But I was very grateful and very, very happy in my work. As Rick said, I went on to work for a number of other newspapers. I worked for the old Boston Phoenix, the Alternative Weekly, worked in California for the San Jose Mercury News after I decided I wanted to get into daily journalism. I worked for the Washington Post, and then finally I was able to come home and work for the only paper I really wanted to work for, the Boston Globe. And now I'm still at it. I've been on the Spotlight team since 2000, more or less, off and on, mostly on. And I'm still fighting the good fight with my wonderful colleagues. I want to talk to you about the movie, but first I want to talk to you about the investigation that led to the movie. And then I'll tell you how the movie got made, I think against all odds, to tell you the truth. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of subjects that are really important to me, and I hope they're important to you too. And one is the state of investigative journalism today, and the other is what the Boston Archdiocese and the Vatican are doing or not doing about clergy sex abuse. So, first of all, whenever I give a talk like this, I like to point out that the Boston Globe Spotlight team did not discover clergy sex abuse, not by any stretch of the imagination. There had been several previous scandals. There was a scandal as far back as the mid-'80s in Louisiana. There was a priest by the name of Gilbert Gauthier, a true pedophile who had molested more than 100 children. This was the first major clergy scandal that broke into public view. The reason it happened is a victim's family broke what was supposed to be an ironclad legal confidentiality agreement, filed a lawsuit, and it got into the newspapers. There was also a scandal in Texas, in Dallas, Texas, regarding a priest by the name of Father Rudy Koss. And then in the early 90s, 10 years before the Spotlight came along, there was a major scandal in Fall River, Massachusetts, the neighboring diocese to the Boston Archdiocese. And there was a priest by the name of James Porter who also molested more than 100 young people over several decades. So we were not first by any means, and there were many other instances of priests who'd been arrested, charged with abusing young people. And every time the church would say, well, this is just one bad apple in a barrel of wonderful priests. So the question, I guess, is what made our work different, and why did we win a Pulitzer Prize for public service, and why did this become a major motion picture? And there were a number of things that made our work very, very different than what had come before. The first thing is we proved that there was a cover-up. In other words, we weren't only writing about instances of young people who were being sexually molested by priests. We proved that high church officials, including Cardinal Bernard Law, knew that a priest by the name of John Geoghegan had spent 30 years molesting more than 100 children in 6 different parishes. We proved that Cardinal Law and the bishops that surrounded him knew that John Geoghegan was a serial molester, and nevertheless shuffled him from parish to parish, covered up his abuses, allowed him to continue working as a priest, and thereby endangering more and more children. The other thing that we did was different was to provide some insight on the scope of the problem. We reported that more than 70 priests in the Boston Archdiocese alone had been accused of molesting young people. 70. In those days, that was a mind-boggling number. The third thing that was different and is really key is our stories were based on the church's own internal documents. We weren't using sources, not even, this was not something that was hearsay. This wasn't officials speaking on the record. These stories were based on the church's own internal records. And that made the stories bulletproof. No one could say that these stories were the result of the Boston Globe's liberal bias or its disagreements with the church on other issues such as contraception. These documents proved the cover-up. These documents shed some light on the scope of the problem. And the fourth thing that was different, and in order to make you appreciate this, I have to take you back to 2002, because what we did seemed innovative at the time. And you might laugh, but we took these documents, the church's internal records, and we posted them online. And back then there was no social media, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, but people were using the internet. And people could read our stories and then go to the actual documents we were describing and see that we were reporting the truth. What we were reporting was factual. And I think that had a profound impact on our readers. And also, it allowed the story to go viral. I think this is the first major journalistic investigation that went viral by using the internet. So those four things really made our work different and really distinguished it. So how did all this come about? How did we achieve those four very special things? And I have to give credit where it's due in a big way, and the movie is very accurate about this. And I want to say that it would not have happened without Marty Baron. Marty Baron was the new editor of the Boston Globe back then. He's now the editor of the Washington Post. And on Marty Baron's very first day of work, he read a column by a wonderful writer who used to work for the Globe named Eileen McNamara. She was a fire-breathing columnist. I miss her dearly. And Eileen had written a column about a number of victims of Father John Geoghegan and some lawsuits that they had filed. And she noted in her column that the documents that were produced during the course of these lawsuits, the documents were impounded by a judge. In other words, they weren't public. No one could read them except the attorneys for the church and the attorney for the victims. And in the course of her column, Eileen wrote the words, she said that because of the court order, the truth may never be known. The truth may never be known. And for Marty Baron, who was a wonderful journalist with incredible integrity, those words were a red flag. Marty Baron believed that it's the job of a journalist to find the truth and to communicate that truth to readers. For Marty, it was unacceptable to say the truth may never be known. So Marty looked around the room of editors, just like you see in the movie, and suggested challenging the court's confidentiality order. And I think people in the room were rather dumbfounded. People were largely Catholic, largely from Boston, very used to the general deference that was afforded to church officials. Nevertheless, Marty's point of view prevailed, and he asked the Globe's legal counsel to look into the possibility of challenging this court order and trying to figure out if we had any chance of succeeding or not. At the same time, Marty met with the editor of the Spotlight team and the supervising editor, and he asked them to see if the Spotlight team could find out anything. In other words, he asked the Spotlight team to have a look at this issue. So we did. This is the new guy in town, and no one wants to displease the new boss. But I think at the same time, we were also pretty intrigued about looking into the Catholic Church, which at that time was the most powerful institution in the city of Boston and in the state of Massachusetts for that matter. So we started to call our sources, and we very quickly found out that there was more than one priest. We thought, based on interviews with attorneys who handled these sorts of cases, that there might be as many as 6. We thought, wow, that would be an incredible story if we had a half a dozen John Geoghegans. And so we started a two-pronged approach. One was to see if we could determine the scope of the problem, and the other one was to go deep on John Geoghegan. And I was the Geoghegan guy, as you see in the movie. And my first order of business was to get to know the very eccentric, paranoid, difficult lawyer, Mitch Garabedian, who was representing the victims who had filed the lawsuits. And I'm great pals with Mitch these days, and if he were standing right here, I'm sure he would not object to me describing him that way. He was a very difficult man. He was very worried about the work he was doing, and with good reason. As I said, the church was the most powerful institution in the city of Boston at the time, and they had filed several complaints against Mitch Garabedian with what's called the Board of Bar Overseers. The Board of Bar Overseers has a great deal of power over attorneys. They have the power to disbar a lawyer and deprive him of making a business. And the church had tried to do this 3 times. So Mitch was a tough nut to crack. And the movie is so accurate in so many ways, and you can see me in the movie trying to romance Mitch Garabedian, and I needed to win the guy's trust. I knew that he knew a lot about the Archdiocese. He had been battling alone against the church for many years, and I needed to find out what he knew. I knew there was more there than met the eye, more that you could glean from reading the lawsuits he had filed. And I won his trust by spending a lot of time with his clients, victims of clergy sex abuse. And these were often meetings in very, very emotional settings with people who had really never talked about their abuse before, except to their lawyer. And I spent many weeks in sessions like this. I mean, I'm not a trained therapist by any means, but that's what I was doing psychotherapy. I would meet with a family, I'd meet with the parents, the kids, everybody. And several times I'd be in a room meeting with people, and within half an hour, everyone would be in tears. So it was emotional. It was gripping. And eventually, Mitch got the idea that I was serious. And Mitch also liked the idea that the Spotlight team was on the case. And I think suddenly he didn't feel so alone. And so we did get to that point that you see when we're on the park bench. And Mitch tells me that he has found a way to get the most explosive of the sealed documents onto the public record. It's complicated, but the movie describes it accurately. If you go back and look at it a second time and listen to what the great Stanley Tucci is saying, he does actually explain how Mitch performed this ingenious legal maneuver abetted by some bad lawyering by the church. In any event, thanks to Mitch finally beginning to trust me and essentially starting to tell me everything he knew about the Archdiocese, I was able to get these records. Even without winning, we did challenge the confidentiality order, but even without winning our case, I was able to get these records thanks to Mitch Garabedian. And the records were pretty extraordinary. I'll describe just a few of them. One was a letter from a bishop in Boston, one of Cardinal Law's right-hand men. And he wrote to Cardinal Law objecting to yet another assignment for the serial pedophile John Gagan. And he said right in this letter, and I think I'm quoting it word for word, that Father John Gagan has a history of homosexual involvement with young boys, and there are complaints against him wherever he goes. Do we want to go through this again? So this proved that John Gagan was not just a bad apple who'd slipped through the cracks. This proved that the highest church officials in the Boston Archdiocese knew exactly who they were dealing with, and they were allowing this man to continue working as a priest, endangering more children who were indeed molested. So another document I will never forget was a letter written by a very devout Catholic woman by the name of Marge Gallant. And she wrote both to Cardinal Law and to his predecessor, Cardinal Medeiros, complaining that John Gagan was on the street again. And in her letters, she said that 7 children in her extended family had been molested, and she had been assured that John Gagan would be taken out of the priesthood. And yet, she was writing because she saw him on the street wearing his collar, gathering a group of children so he could take them out for an ice cream. So these were really heartbreaking letters, and like I say, also proved the cover-up. At about this time, we did win our motion to make all of the documents in the John Gagan case public. We were very surprised. The case went to a judge by the name of Constance Sweeney, and we did a little research on her and found out that she was the product of 16 years of Catholic education. So we thought, well, we're probably not going to win this one. But to our surprise, she ruled in our favor, and that meant that we were going to get 10,000 pages of internal church documents on John Gagan alone. And these would be records about the complaints filed against him, the places where he had gone to receive treatment, and the decisions that were made by various review boards to allow him to continue practicing as a priest. At the same time, this small group of reporters made a lot of progress in determining the scope of the problem. We were getting a lot of information from lawyers, from victims, and suddenly we found ourselves with just a tremendous amount of highly explosive information. And so in January of 2002, we published 4 blockbuster stories. The first story on January 6, 2002, was about the cover-up. We reported that Cardinal Law knew that John Geoghegan had spent 30 years molesting children and nevertheless allowed him to continue working as a priest. The second story was based on John Geoghegan's psychiatric records. And the big takeaway from this story was that John Geoghegan had an MO that we would learn would be the MO of many other sexually abusive priests. And what he did is he targeted broken homes, working class broken homes, single mothers struggling to raise 2 or 3 or 4 children on their own who desperately needed the help of a priest and would be very flattered by the attention of a priest. Many of these were troubled families, which is part of the MO, because I think the calculation of the pedophile was that, well, if any of these families ever complained, who would believe them? They were disreputable. They lived in the housing projects. They had problems with alcoholism. They had problems with the law. Who would believe these people? So I think that was part of the really devious calculation. The third story we wrote was based on the 10,000 pages of documents that we got in the Geoghegan case. And the takeaway here was, I think, just from the casual letters that Cardinal Law and other church officials wrote to John Geoghegan as he was caught time and time again molesting children. And the letters from Cardinal Law always read something to the effect of, "Dear Jack," it was always "Dear Jack. Dear Jack, we're so grateful for your ministry, and we're sorry that you had this bump in the road in your marvelous career. Look forward to having you back among us." So there was tremendous understanding, forgiveness, compassion for this serial molester. And there was never anywhere in all the 10,000 pages any similar understanding or compassion for the children or their families. The fourth story we wrote was about the scope of the problem. This is the story in which we reported that 70 priests in the Boston Archdiocese had been credibly accused of molesting children. By the time we finished our reporting a year later, the number was 150. And today that number is more than 250, just in the Boston Archdiocese. Priests who've been accused of molesting children credibly since about 1950. So that's just the Boston Archdiocese. So after the 4 blockbuster stories, we began to get, just like you see in the movie, and we received it was like a tidal wave of telephone calls and messages from people. Most of them were victims with stories about more priests. In addition, our court victory ended up being a precedent, a legal precedent, so that we would get all the records of all the complaints against all the priests who were accused of abusing young people in Boston. So the story literally exploded, and we increased the size of our team. We went from 4 reporters to 8 reporters, and we published 600 stories over the next years until on December 13th, Cardinal Law finally resigned and fled to the Vatican. And I say fled because there were 2 grand jury investigations into his activities, one state, one federal. And as you may know, the Vatican is a separate nation state, and we have no extradition treaty with the Vatican. So we kept reporting for another 3 months into March of 2003 until we'd exhausted the patience of our readers, I believe, and also exhausted our own emotional reserves, and went on to another project. So all that was 2002 and 2003, and the question is, how does that become a movie? Well, it doesn't. Years went by, nothing happened, and we weren't surprised because we never thought it would be a movie. I mean, if you think about it, what do? We sit at our desks, we read musty court documents, we talk on the phone, and we sit around with our feet on the desk and talk. Now, if anyone thinks that's going to make a major action thriller, I say good luck to you. So never in our wildest dreams did we think anything like this would happen. But what did happen is Columbia Journalism School adopted the case study model, and they made the Spotlight team's investigation into the Catholic Church, one of their case studies for students. And they hired a guy by the name of David Meisner to write a narrative of our investigation. And David is a novelist. And he wrote a terrific synopsis of our investigation. It's about a 30-page document. He really just kind of nailed it. I really admire his work. And I went over it with him, and I did some editing for him. And at the end, when it was all set to go, he said to me, you know, this would make a great movie. And I said, you're crazy. All the big moments come when I'm sitting at my desk reading documents. And he said, no, trust me, this will make a great movie. And there are a couple of producers who optioned one of my novels, and would you mind if I told them? And I said, no, knock yourself out. And I told my colleagues on the Spotlight team, and the basic attitude was, heck, no one else is knocking on our door. Let's see what happens. And so we got approached by two very young producers, Nicole Rockland and Bly Faust. I checked them out, of course, and they did not have very long records. They didn't have a lot of experience, but they had a lot of sincerity, and they seemed to be very hardworking. One of them had been an entertainment lawyer, and they pitched the project to us as a movie that would be about the importance of journalism at a time when journalism is really in crisis. And we thought, well, that sounded pretty good. So we gave them a free option on our life rights, and they went away, and years went by. And they had a lot of trouble finding anyone who would touch this project. They were looking to get a named director or a named screenwriter to take this on, and nobody would. Finally, they went to a company called Anonymous Content, and that's when things started to happen because Anonymous Content has some money. And they hired two terrifically talented guys to take this project on. They hired Tom McCarthy to direct the project, and they hired Josh Singer to be the screenwriter. And these are two just tremendously talented guys. I can't say enough about them, really. I met with Josh. I was in Los Angeles at the time, back and forth, and Josh and I had several long lunches, and by the end of a week and a half, he had 54 pages of notes that he now refers to as the Bible. And Tom and Josh interviewed all of us. They came to Boston. They spent a lot of time in town, and I remember driving them around the city, showing them the mansion where Cardinal Law lived. And they did their own reporting. They interviewed our sources, they interviewed lawyers, they interviewed victims, and they also read the archives. They reported on our investigation. And they came back to us maybe 6 months after they were through interviewing us, and they had written a brilliant script. And still no one would touch it. And there's a little black humor in Hollywood. Every year, Hollywood folks get together and they vote on the best script that hasn't been produced, and Spotlight won that dubious award. And then what happened is a wonderful guy by the name of Mark Ruffalo came along, and he read the script, and he decided he wanted to do it. And that meant a lot because Mark is really at the top of his game. He's probably at the peak of his career. I hesitate to say that because I think he's going to do even more and bigger things. Mark is also a political activist, and he liked the idea of doing this story about clergy sex abuse at a time when we had Pope Francis, who is a pope who seems to want to make a lot of changes. So Mark was very excited about doing the project at this time. And because Mark is such a wonderful, open-hearted, generous guy, everybody loves to work with him. So as soon as Mark signed on, Michael Keaton signed on, and the rest of this wonderful cast also signed on. So then there was a great script and an incredible cast, and still nobody wanted to make it. And finally, the connection was made with a company called Participant Media, which is an interesting film company because it was set up by a couple of well-meaning billionaires who wanted to make movies specifically with a social purpose. And Spotlight was just all the way up their alley. So finally, things started to happen, and the cast was assembled, the crew was assembled, everybody came up to Boston, and a lot of the movie was shot in Boston, probably 20% of it was shot in Boston. Meanwhile, the cast was spending a lot of time with all of us on the Spotlight team. The cast, I think, was very excited to do this movie for a couple of reasons. One is it was a movie about something really important. It wasn't just another superhero comic book action movie. And I think they were also really excited to play real people who were still alive that they could study. And study us they did. We went to so many wonderful dinners and we were all having a great time, and only later do we realize that they were really paying very close attention to our mannerisms and our thought processes, and they were emptying our pockets the same way we empty the pockets of our sources. So, as I said, about 20% of it was shot in Boston, about 20% of it was shot up in Toronto. We all spent a lot of time on set. I spent a lot of time with Mark Ruffalo. He visited my home. He shadowed me at the Globe, and I really enjoyed getting to know him. And I think all the members of the Spotlight team feel the same way about the actors who portrayed them. All of us, I think, feel very lucky that our stories landed in the hands of such talented people. Still, I, for one, never thought that this movie would win an Academy Award for Best Picture. Even as the movie was being shot, I thought to myself, well, this will be a pretty good movie. It'll probably open in some art house and play for a couple of weeks, get a few good reviews, and slip beneath the waves, never to be heard from again. So everybody went away, and Tom McCarthy went to work with his editor, and they came to Boston once and showed us a rough cut of the film. And what I mean by a rough cut is it's a version of the film that has a fake soundtrack, and it's not quite color corrected, and the scenes sometimes don't quite mesh. But so they came and they showed us this rough cut, and they wanted to know what we thought. All along the way, Tom and Josh were just incredible, I think, because they wanted our input all along the way, and the actors did too. So poor Tom and Josh, they came with the rough cut, and I think they expected to have a very robust, intense conversation about the movie. And we were all stunned into silence. I mean, it was such a emotional experience to see ourselves portrayed on screen. And by the way, it was a very tough time of our lives, I think. The work was very grueling, and it was just a hard time, and I think we didn't really want to go all the way back, and the movie took us all the way back. But eventually, we told Tom and Josh that we love the movie, and we do, very much. It's incredible that it won Best Picture Academy Award. I think what's more important to us is that the movie has given our work a second life, and the survivors love it, and that's the best thing of all. The survivors love this movie because it validates their story. The survivors are people who were ignored for decades by the church and felt ashamed of their experience. Many of them believed that they were at fault. And our work, I think, liberated thousands, maybe tens of thousands of survivors all over the world to finally say, hey, you know, this happened to me and it was wrong. And the movie just amplified all that. And because of the movie, there are another wave of survivors who have come forward to tell their stories. And I'm very, very grateful for that. So this takes me to what the impact of this movie might be for journalism and for the teachers and students here at Stony Brook. And, you know, this movie is often compared to All the President's Men. And I think it's a very apt comparison for a couple of reasons. One, both are local stories. These were both local stories. The Watergate was about a 2-bit break-in, and it was covered by a couple of young crime reporters. And Spotlight was about one priest, just one. And both stories went national and both stories went global. So they have that in common. Another thing they have in common is they both are about, really, the cover-up. They both exemplify the adage, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. So they have that in common as well. All the President's Men, in addition, inspired another generation, a new generation of young people to become journalists, good journalists, the kind of reporters that you see depicted in the Spotlight movie, the kind of journalists who want to get the truth. And the question is, will Spotlight have a similar effect today? And I, for one, hope it does. Journalism is in a state of crisis. Howie and I were talking about this earlier, and Rick as well. And it's a serious crisis. The internet, despite all the wonderful things about it, has destroyed the revenue model for newspapers. And as a result, editors are cutting their staffs and cutting their investigative staff, sometimes to the bone. And it's a very serious problem. I, for one, believe that without investigative reporting, democracy itself will not work. It's really only investigative reporters, when you think about it, who hold powerful institutions and powerful people accountable for what they do and what they say, and provide citizens in a democracy the information they need in order to make decisions. So I think without journalism, we're really in a lot of trouble. The problem is most acute, I think, at smaller newspapers, where editors are really under a lot of pressure. Newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post are working with new revenue models that I think may work, but they'll only work for them. They're very particular to the way those news organizations are set up. Other organizations like the Boston Globe are facing increasing financial stress. Now, I can say that at the Boston Globe, I'm happy to say that even though our staff is a lot smaller than it was in 2001, our spotlight team is bigger. We have 6 people now, not 4. And that's because the paper does have an altruistic commitment to investigative reporting. We believe that's how we fulfill our responsibility, and I underscore responsibility under the First Amendment. But we also think it's good business sense. And we do readership surveys, and what readers tell us is that people love the spotlight team, and people want investigative reporting. And I think people expect their news organizations to hold public officials and other powerful people accountable. So I personally think that when editors start cutting their investigative staffs, they're being penny wise and pound foolish. In other words, they may get a little pat on the head from some higher level editor or a publisher for saving money in year 1, but I think in year 2, 3, 4, their readers, listeners, viewers will desert them because they're not going to be getting the kind of information that they want and expect. So that leads me to the Catholic Church and what's happening with the Catholic Church. And the two issues come together for me because, in my opinion, the church still needs to be held accountable for dealing with clergy sex abuse. I can tell you that in the Boston Archdiocese, Cardinal Sean O'Malley has taken some admirable measures to prevent child sex abuse. For instance, everyone in the Archdiocese who deals with children has to undergo a criminal background check. And there are awareness classes for both children and adults to help people recognize when a child predator might be in their midst. And at the Vatican, I think there also have been some hopeful signs. Pope Francis started a commission to study clergy sex abuse. He named Boston Archbishop Sean O'Malley to be the head of it. But I'll tell you, when you look at local dioceses, not many have copied Cardinal O'Malley's model. Not many are following his lead. And so I think it's important for local reporters to take a look at what their dioceses are doing and hold them accountable. I mean, in 2003, there was a meeting of Catholic bishops from around the country in Dallas, Texas, and they produced a document. They produced a document called the Charter for the Protection of Young People and Children. And I think reporters should take a look at this document and find out if their local bishop is adhering to the principles in this document. I would bet that they would find they're not. For instance, one of the principles is transparency. The bishops all dedicated themselves to transparency. And I would venture to guess that 80% of the dioceses in America are not being transparent with issues of past clergy sex abuse and things they're doing today. That's just for starters. Secondly, I have to say that when it comes to the Vatican, this commission has been meeting for 2 years and has not produced anything meaningful. They haven't produced a meaningful document. They haven't produced any meaningful recommendations. Furthermore, I neglected to say that Pope Francis also started a tribunal to hold bishops accountable for covering up clergy sex abuse. And the tribunal has not taken action on a single bishop. And this is upsetting, of course, to the survivors of clergy sex abuse, as you might imagine. But I have to tell you, believe it or not, I talk to a lot of priests, and the priests are also upset. The priests believe that they've been thrown under the bus, so to speak, while the bishops have gotten away with everything. The bishops, after all, are the ones who have covered up the abuse in diocese after diocese after diocese, and very few have been held accountable. So I think this is an issue not just for survivors, but the priests themselves. One thing the Vatican has done is speed up the process for defrocking accused priests, and it's particularly irksome for the fellow priests who are good priests. I can tell you that for sure. So these are the issues that reporters have to take up. I think local reporters have to hold their bishops accountable. Reporters from larger news organizations should be holding the Vatican accountable. And so I guess I would close with a message for all the journalism students, because I hope all of you are inspired by the movie and the work of the Spotlight team. And these are troubling times. I can't guarantee that you'll make much of a living if you go into journalism right now. But what I can guarantee you is if you take up the cause of investigative reporting, you may find yourself leading a life of meaning and purpose. And I think that's worth a lot. And with that message, I would say, thanks very much.
Wow, thanks.
Sure. My pleasure.
So when Michael was talking about his belief that this would never be made into a movie, what he failed to tell you was that in his spare time, he's a scriptwriter, screenwriter. Got a master's from the American Film Institute in Los Angeles, won the prize for the best screenplay in your class. This must all be pretty painful, huh?
Well, it is, and I got to credit Rick for being the reporter that he is, because all of this is really quite embarrassing.
You know, we're supposed to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
Exactly. I mean, it is a strange experience to have written several screenplays and having not seen any of them produced, and then see a movie produced about me. It's very odd, very strange.
And one that you never thought would be
and one that I thought would never become a movie, a story that I thought would never become a movie. It's true.
So you were talking earlier about, you know, talking to the victims. You mentioned how difficult it was to see the movie because it took you back to that place. Yeah, it's a life of meaning and purpose, but it takes a toll. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, how you deal with that? I mean, it's difficult.
It is difficult. You know, reporters have a sort of a macho ethic that we can take anything. You know, I think we cover fires, we cover shootings, and some reporters cover wars, and we see a lot of terrible things, and somehow we believe we're just capable of absorbing all of it. But it does take a toll. Working on the Spotlight investigation was an enormous amount of work. We worked from early in the morning until late at night. There was a period when we wrote a book about our reporting. And during this period, I remember I would get up in the morning. Typically, I would go down to the courthouse, get some records, make my way into the Globe. I'd write a page one story. I'd be at the Globe till 9 or 10 o'clock answering questions from editors, and this would go on 5 days a week. And on Saturday, I would get up and I would start working on the book. And I would work on the book Saturday and Sunday. And then on Monday, I would be back at the Globe working from 9 in the morning till 9 at night. And of course, the stories we were hearing were pretty awful. I mean, we were listening to victim after victim, survivor after survivor tell us these terribly sad stories, sometimes involving suicides of people whose lives had really been ruined. I mean, just completely ruined. And I don't know how we dealt with it, really. I think most of us dealt with it internally. I remember that in March of 2003, after more than a year and a half of this reporting, we decided finally we were going to start a new project. And the new project was investigating corruption in charitable foundations. And this work involved reading tax returns, 990 tax returns. If you've ever worked for a nonprofit, you know you file a special tax return. And it's normally not the kind of project that I would be wild about, I have to tell you. But in this case, I was so incredibly grateful that I could sit at my desk and read tax documents and look at numbers and not have to go out and listen to another sad story again.
So, as is often the case, Dean Schneider and I disagree on parts of the movie.
This is healthy.
So, and one of the things is that he, I think, found it unbelievable that Walter Robinson had this story. I mean, for all of those of you who've seen the movie, to me, it's the most amazing, part of the movie, because it shows that it's not just, journalists are great, riding to the rescue, but they're flawed. There's so much verisimilitude in this movie. That's what I think, by the way, is what made it so successful, because it was so honest. But anyway, how on earth could you get a letter with the names of 20 priests and do a story that winds up on B43?
Well, first of all, with all due respect to Howie, I do agree with Rick on this point. I think it's the great strength of the movie because it does show us as human beings and not as heroes. I think the movie in general shows how we basically do our work, which is spending a lot of time stumbling around in the dark, going down blind alleys, getting doors slammed in our faces, and sometimes missing things that we shouldn't miss. This is how investigative reporters really live and work. I mean, this is it. We're very imperfect. And newspapers are very imperfect. So how does that happen? Well, I don't know how it happened specifically. None of us remembers getting this list. None of us remembers reading the story that appeared on page B43. Yes, Walter Robinson was the Metro editor, but he did not directly supervise this reporter. There was another editor between the Metro editor and the religion writer. So none of us could really explain it. And I think, as I said, it shows how imperfect we are. Newsrooms are very chaotic, and often you have, the phones just ring and ring and ring, and usually you have some college interns who are taking the phones. And maybe they are capable of recognizing a good tip, maybe they're not. We get a lot of mail that no one ever reads. It goes right into the wastebasket because there's a mountain of it. And why we missed this story that ran on page, this story actually got into the paper, but we all missed it. And it's our fault. We shouldn't have missed it. But I think what's brilliant about the movie is it uses this faux pas to make a larger point. And the larger point, I think, is the movie is trying to show that everybody knew this was going on, and everybody had a collective responsibility to say something, and so many, many people did not. Whether it's the lawyers, whether it's the police, you see at the beginning of the movie, whether it's the spokesperson for Boston College High School, whether it's the Boston Globe. And I gotta say, we now know that this phenomenon of clergy sex abuse was happening in every major city in America, and every major city in America had a major metropolitan daily newspaper, and they didn't do the story either. Finally, we did.
Yeah. So, I guess to me, the mystery that's not addressed in this movie is why John Law gave Gehagen a free pass 30 times or whatever it was.
Well,
I mean, I know you don't have any, you've read all of the documents.
Yeah.
So there must be something in there that,
I do.
How
Actually,
can you rationalize this?
Yeah, I have thought about that very deeply, as you might imagine. And I have a couple of answers for that. And one is that Father John Gehagen had an uncle who was his father figure. John Gehagen's father died when he was young. And his uncle, who was a priest, became his principal father figure. And it was this uncle who actually forced John Gehagen into the priesthood against his will. Father John Gehagen had really a terrible life. And, but his father figure, his uncle, was very, very influential in the Boston Archdiocese. He had started a new parish in one of the growing suburbs outside of Boston, and he was politically influential. And at some point, at the end of a year of reporting, we were able to get Cardinal Law's personal calendar. And we found that he had met with many of these priests who were abusers. He knew exactly what was going on. He met with them personally. And he also had several meetings with John Gehagen's uncle. So I think, number one, I think John Gagan was allowed to continue acting as a priest and molesting children because he had a very influential uncle in the archdiocese. That's number one. Number two, I think the Catholic Church in this case behaved like any other institution would. I mean, its first instinct is to protect itself. And number three, the clergy in the Catholic Church, this is a secretive, elite, all-male institution. And I think there's a lack of understanding on the damage that sex abuse does to children. I think many of the people in the clergy in the church, they simply don't have an appreciation for what this does to children. So I think those are just a few of the reasons why cardinal law allowed this to happen. I could actually go on, but I think there are many interesting things that explain this. But of course, I think that's the central question when you take a look at the records and you listen to the stories of the victims. You think, my God, how could church officials allow this to happen? But they have all over the world.
Right.